The sun was setting over the quiet suburban neighborhood of Willow Creek, casting long shadows over the rows of identical houses. Each home was a mirror image of the next, with perfectly manicured lawns, white picket fences, and two-car garages. It was a place where conformity was king, and the Homeowners Association, HOA, ruled with an iron fist. At the helm of this suburban empire was Margaret Holloway, a woman whose icy demeanor and sharp tongue had earned her the nickname, the Iron Lady of Willow Creek. But not everyone in Willow Creek bowed to Margaret's will. At the end of a cul-de-sac stood a house that didn't fit the mold. It was an old, two-story Victorian home with a wraparound porch, a weathered shingle roof, and a garden that looked more like a wild jungle than a curated landscape. This was the home of Henry Grayson, a retired Marine Corps colonel who had seen more battles than most people could imagine. Henry had lived in the house for over 40 years, and he wasn't about to let anyone, especially not Margaret Holloway, tell him how to live his life. Henry's grandson, Ethan, pulled into the driveway of the old Victorian house after a long day at work. He had always admired his grandfather's stubbornness, but lately, it seemed like the HOA was pushing harder than ever. The notices had been coming more frequently: citations for the overgrown garden, the peeling paint, the unsightly porch swing that Henry refused to remove. Each time, Henry would simply toss the notices into the trash and mutter something about pencil-pushing bureaucrats. But something fell off as Ethan stepped out of his car. The front door was ajar, swaying slightly in the breeze. Henry never left the door open. He was a man of routine, and leaving the door unlocked, let alone wide open, was not part of that routine. Ethan's heart began to race as he approached the house, his boots crunching on the gravel driveway. "Grandpa," Ethan called out as he stepped onto the porch. There was no answer. The house was eerily quiet, save for the creak of the old wooden floorboards beneath his feet. Ethan's eyes scanned the leaving room, but everything seemed untouched. The same worn leather armchair sat in the corner, the same military medals hung on the wall, and the same faded American flag was displayed above the fireplace. But then Ethan noticed something on the kitchen table: a single envelope with the HOA logo stamped in the corner. His stomach churned as he picked it up. The letter inside was a formal notice, but the message was anything but subtle. Notice of property violation. Immediate action required. At the bottom, scrawled in ink, were the words, "This is your final warning." Ethan's hands trembled as he crumpled the letter in his fist. He knew the HOA had been after his grandfather for years, but this was different. Henry was missing, and the only thing left behind was a letter from the people who wanted him gone. Without thinking, Ethan stormed out of the house and jumped back into his car. He drove straight to the HOA office, his mind racing with anger and fear. The glass door slammed against the wall as he burst into the office, startling the receptionist, a young woman with a tight ponytail and a name tag that read Jessica. "Where is he?" Ethan demanded, his voice low and dangerous. Jessica blinked up at him, clearly taken aback. "I'm sorry, who are you looking for?" "Henry Grayson. My grandfather. He's missing, and the only thing left in his house was a letter from you people." Ethan slapped the crumpled notice onto the desk. "So I'll ask again, where the hell is he?" Jessica's expression didn't change, but there was a flicker of unease in her eyes. She reached for the intercom and pressed a button. "Ms. Holloway, you have a VY cider." A few moments later, Margaret Holloway emerged from her office. She was in her late 50s, with perfectly styled blonde hair and a designer suit that screamed authority. She looked more like a corporate CEO than the president of a suburban HOA, but Ethan knew better. Margaret Holloway was a predator, and she had been circling his grandfather for years. "Mr. Grayson," she greeted smoothly, her voice dripping with false politeness. "To what do we owe the pleasure?" Ethan crossed the room in 3 strides, his eyes locked on hers. "Where's my grandfather?" Margaret tilted her head, a faint smirk playing on her lips. "Your grandfather? Oh dear, is he missing?" She clicked her tongue, feigning concern. "That's just awful." Ethan wasn't buying it. "Don't play games with me. I know you've been trying to get him out of that house for years, and now, out of nowhere, he just disappears? And all I find is another one of your goddamn letters." Margaret let out a small, deliberate sigh, as if she were dealing with an unruly child. "Mr. Grayson, I understand you're upset, but perhaps you should take a breath. People leave all the time. Maybe he decided he didn't want to fight anymore. Maybe he moved to a retirement home. Maybe. Ethan slammed his fist against her desk, causing the picture frames to rattle. He didn't go anywhere willingly. He wouldn't just disappear without telling me. And he sure as hell wouldn't leave his house with the front door wide open. Margaret's smirk faded just a fraction. She glanced toward Jessica, who was suddenly very interested in her keyboard. Ethan took a step closer, locking eyes with her. Tell me where he is. Margaret met his gaze without flinching. I'm afraid I can't help you, she said, her tone light, almost bored. Perhaps you should try the police. Ethan let out a bitter laugh. The police? Right, because that worked so well last time I called them about you harassing my grandfather. Margaret didn't even blink. That's a serious accusation, Mr. Grayson. You're damn right it is. She sighed again, this time more dramatically. Look, if you're that concerned, why don't you check with the retirement homes in town? Maybe he decided to take a little vacation. Ethan's VY sound flashed white-hot with rage. A vacation? His grandfather, the man who barely left his house unless it was absolutely necessary? The man who hated the idea of nursing homes and would rather drop dead on his porch than let someone else tell him where to live? This wasn't just some bureaucratic nonsense anymore. This was a threat. Ethan stepped back, forcing himself to take a breath before he said something that would land him in jail. I swear to God, if I find out you had anything to do with this. Margaret merely smiled, tilting her head ever so slightly. Be careful with your accusations, Mr. Grayson. You wouldn't want to say something you might regret. Ethan stared at her, his pulse pounding in his ears. She knew exactly where his grandfather was. She was taunting him. He turned on his heel and stormed out, but not before catching the way Margaret exchanged a look with Jessica. It was quick, barely noticeable, but it was there a flicker of unease, a quiet, wordless confirmation. She was hiding something, and Ethan was going to find out what. Ethan sat in his truck, gripping the steering wheel so hard his knuckles turned white. His jaw was clenched, his breath coming in sharp, controlled inhales. The HOA was covering something up. Margaret's smug little smirk, the way she dodged his questions, the look she shared with her assistant, it all screamed guilty as hell. But what gnawed at him the most was the absolute certainty that they weren't afraid. Not of him, not of the police, not of any consequences. They weren't just arrogant, they were protected. Which meant his grandfather was in real danger. Ethan slammed his fist against the dashboard, his frustration bubbling over into barely controlled rage. He needed a plan. He needed backup. But who the hell could he call? The police? Useless. They'd probably just shrug and file a missing persons report that would collect dust for weeks. A lawyer? That would take too long. He needed someone who could do more than just ask questions. He needed someone who could act. And then, out of nowhere, a memory hit him like a sledgehammer. If anything ever happens to me, don't waste time. Call this number. His grandfather's voice echoed in his head, calm but firm, the way it always was when he was serious. Ethan had laughed it off at the time, thinking it was just old war paranoia. But his grandfather had scribbled a number in the back of his beat-up leather notebook and handed it to him anyway. I mean it, Ethan. Call them. Ethan had rolled his eyes, muttering something about conspiracy theories, but his grandfather had just looked at him, and that look had been enough to silence any protest. Now, staring at the empty passenger seat where his grandfather should have been, Ethan realized it wasn't paranoia. It was preparation. With shaking fingers, he dug the notebook out of the glove compartment. The number was still there, faded but legible. No name, no details, just a number. He hesitated, his thumb hovering over the dial button. This is insane, he thought. It could be nothing. Some outdated contact from his grandfather's military days. Maybe a buddy from his old unit. Maybe a long-disconnected government line that would lead to nothing but an error message. But then he thought about the open door, the letter on the table, Margaret Holloway smirking like she already knew how the story would end. Ethan swallowed hard, exhaled through his nose, and pressed the call button. It rang once, twice, 3 times, then the click of a connection. No automated menu, no robotic greeting, just a deep, steady voice on the other end. This is Agent Blake. Ethan's throat went dry. He hadn't even spoken yet, but whoever this was, they weren't answering like a regular person. There was no hello or who is this, just straight to business. I was told to call this number if something happened to Henry Grayson, Ethan said, forcing the words out. Silence. Not the kind of silence that meant confusion. This was something else. The kind of pause that meant the person on the other end was already putting things together. Then the voice came back, sharper, more focused. What happened to him? Ethan tightened his grip on the phone. He's gone. His house was left open. No sign of a struggle, but the only thing left behind was a letter from the HOA. And they're lying through their teeth about it. Another pause. Then something changed in the agent's tone. Where are you right now? Ethan sat up straighter. In my truck, just outside their office. Stay there. Don't move. Don't talk to anyone else. Do you understand me? A cold shiver ran down Ethan's spine. He had expected skepticism, maybe some half-hearted promise to look into it. He hadn't expected immediate orders. Who are you? Ethan asked. 15 minutes, was all Agent Blake said before the line went dead. Ethan stared at his phone, his heart hammering. And then, in the distance, he heard them engines. 3 black SUVs tearing down the suburban streets like they had every right to be there. Ethan barely had time to brace himself before they screeched to a halt in front of the HOA office. Doors flew open, and armed men in suits stepped out. And suddenly, for the first time since this nightmare started, Ethan realized he might not have been prepared for what was coming next. Margaret Holloway had built her career on control. Every meeting, every interaction, every carefully orchestrated scheme she dictated the terms. She was the queen of the Willow Creek HOA, untouchable, feared, and obeyed without question. She had seen homeowners tremble at the sight of her official citations, watched grown men break under the weight of endless fines and legal threats. She had bullied, coerced, and manipulated her way into an empire built on fear. But fear had never felt like this. The moment the glass door to the HOA office swung open, it was like a black hole had entered the room, sucking all the air out. The quiet hum of office chatter died instantly. Phone stopped ringing. The sound of keystrokes from Jessica's computer came to an abrupt halt. Margaret turned, expecting some local cop or maybe an angry homeowner foolish enough to challenge her authority. Instead, she came face to face with men in suits, not the cheap polyester kind worn by HOA lawyers, but government suits, tailored, precise, dark as midnight. There were 4 of them, no name tags, no badges on display, but Margaret didn't need a flashing sign to know exactly what they were. Federal. Her stomach plummeted. The man in the lead, a broad-shouldered agent with cold, steel-blue eyes, reached into his suit jacket and pulled out a document. He didn't hand it to her. He didn't ask for permission. He simply held it up, letting the weight of its presence settle over the room. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. A federal search warrant. No warning, no prior notice, no opportunity to stall. They knew. They knew. She forced a breath, willing her hands not to tremble as she folded them over her desk. "I'm sorry, who exactly are you?" Her voice came out thin, fragile the sharpness she was known for nowhere to be found. The lead agent didn't blink. "Where is Henry Grayson?" The way he said it, cold, direct, surgical, made her spine go rigid. Margaret knew how to lie. It was second nature to her, an art perfected through years of EVY tie-ins and fabricated violations. But something in the way they were looking at her, like she was already classified, already processed, already guilty, sent a raw chill down her spine. She swallowed, forced herself to recover. "Henry Grayson? Oh, I'm afraid I don't know where he is." Silence. Not the silence of uncertainty, not the silence of hesitation, the kind of silence that said, "We already know you're lying." The lead agent stepped forward, resting both hands on her desk. His presence was suffocating. His voice, when he spoke, was measured as slow, methodical death sentence. "You know, Margaret," he said, his gaze sharpening, slicing into her like a scalpel. "I don't think you quite understand the jar tie of the situation." Her pulse spiked. "We don't just know about Henry Grayson," he continued. "We know about the fraudulent citations, the under-the-table deals with developers, the forged votes on HOA amendments, the illegal property seizures." He tilted his head, studying her reaction. "Shall I go on?" Jessica, sitting just a few feet away, visibly shrank in her chair. She was typing again, probably pretending to be busy, but her fingers were shaking against the keyboard. Margaret forced a smile. but her jaw felt locked in place. This is ridiculous. These are outrageous claims. I have no idea what you're talking about. A slow blink from the agent, the kind that said, "We've dealt with your type before." Margaret felt her stomach lurch as he reached into his suit again, this time pulling out a black folder. He let it drop onto her desk with a soft, deadly thud. The folder flipped open: documents, photos. Margaret's breath hitched. There were drone images of cash transactions between HOA board members and developers, screenshots of emails discussing how to fabricate violations against homeowners, signed contracts that directly contradicted public records. And then, at the very bottom, an image of Henry Grayson, bound, eyes fierce but face bruised. Margaret's world tilted. The air squeezed out of her lungs. The lead agent tapped the photo with 2 fingers. "Where is he?" Margaret opened her mouth. Nothing came out. She felt exposed, stripped bare. Her usual defenses were useless. The agent's gaze never wavered. And then, as if her silence was answer enough, he turned slightly toward one of the other agents, a silent, wordless command. The second agent nodded and pulled out his phone. "Team Bravo, we have confirmation," he said into the receiver. "Move on the target location." Margaret felt something deep in her stomach drop into a freefall. They weren't asking anymore. They already knew where to go and they were on their way. The basement smelled of damp concrete and bad decisions. Henry Grayson sat bound to a chair, wrists zip-tied, a bruise forming along his cheekbone. But he was grinning. "I thought you'd get here faster," he said, his eyes sharp as ever. Ethan exhaled a mix of relief and disbelief. "You good?" Henry flexed his hands as an agent cut him loose. "Oh, I've had worse. These HOA boys. Amateurs." Agent Blake scanned the room. "Sir, can you confirm who detained you?" Henry rolled his shoulders, standing with a wince. "Sure." But first, he reached into his boot, pulling out a USB drive. He flipped it toward Blake. "That's every illegal land grab, every fraud scheme, every threat the HOA has pulled in the last 15 years. Ethan blinked. "What? How?" Henry smirked. "Because these morons thought I was just some stubborn old vet. They didn't know I spent 20 years in counterintelligence after the war. Didn't know I've been watching them since they started coming after me." Blake studied the drive. "So you let them take you?" Henry shrugged. "Figured they'd lead me straight to the top." Ethan ran a hand through his hair. "Grandpa, what the hell?" Henry clapped his shoulder. "Welcome to the real world, kid." Blake turned to his team. "Get this analyzed. We're ending this tonight." Henry grinned. "Damn right we are." The crowd closed in, voices sharp with anger. Margaret Holloway, usually so composed, looked pale, her eyes darting as the weight of the situation crashed down on her. "This is a mistake," she gasped, hands raised. "We were just trying to keep the neighborhood looking respectable." A bitter laugh shot from the crowd. "Respectable? Mister?" Holloway scoffed. "You stole homes. You threatened us." Another voice yelled, "You're a fraud." Margaret turned to the agents, desperate. "We were enforcing regulations." Blake didn't even blink. Henry smiled. "You weren't protecting homes," he said, his voice steady. "You were protecting your power." Blake pulled out the stack of documents, proof of fraud, illegal land grabs, and threats. He held them up for the crowd to see. The truth was undeniable. Someone spit near Margaret's feet. "Lock her up. Lock her up. Lock her up." Margaret flinched. Blake gave the nod, and handcuffs snapped around her wrists. Henry exhaled, satisfied. The HOA's reign was over. The fall of the Willow Creek HOA wasn't just a takedown, it was a reckoning. The arrests started early in the morning, just as the suburban streets were waking up. Black SUVs and unmarked government cars rolled into the neighborhood like a silent invasion, stopping outside pristine, meticulously maintained homes. Federal agents moved fast. They didn't just go after Margaret Holloway, they went after all of them. Every board member who had signed off on fraudulent citations, every corrupt official who had looked the other way, every developer who had paid bribes to seize land. No one was safe. Some were pulled from their beds, barely awake when their doors were kicked in. Others were yanked from their offices, surrounded by agents in suits while their stunned employees watched in horror. One board member was caught mid-golf swing at an exclusive country club, a perfectly aimed shot interrupted by the cold click of handcuffs. The FBI froze their assets on the spot, bank accounts locked, property deals canceled. Every dirty transaction, every under-the-table deal, every stolen home, all of it was laid bare for the world to see. By mid-afternoon, the story had exploded across national news. FBI raids HOA board members in unprecedented corruption case. Suburban extortion ring exposed. Millions in fraudulent violations uncovered. Homeowners rejoiced as HOA leaders faced federal charges. Ethan scrolled through his phone, reading article after article, watching video clips of stunned newscasters reporting on one of the biggest suburban corruption scandals in history. And the best part? There was no way out for them. They couldn't pay their way out of this. They couldn't intimidate their way out of this. They had spent years playing judge, jury, and executioner, but now they were the ones being judged. And Margaret Holloway? She was done. The once untouchable queen of the HOA was reduced to a trembling mess, standing on the front steps of the board office as agents placed her in handcuffs. Cameras flashed in her face. Reporters shouted over each other. "Miss Holloway, do you deny the allegations? Miss Holloway, were you aware of the fraud? What do you have to say to the homeowners who lost their property because of you?" Margaret's mouth opened, but no words came out. The same woman who had spent years running this place with an iron fist suddenly had nothing to say. She had controlled everything until now. And Henry Grayson? Henry Grayson was watching from his porch, looking as relaxed as ever. The same house they had spent years trying to erase, the same home they had called an eyesore, was now officially off limits to the HOA forever. With the evidence from Henry's USB drive, the government had classified the Grayson house as a historic landmark. No HOA, no developers, no legal loopholes. They couldn't touch it. The house they tried to destroy was now untouchable. It was poetic. It was perfect. Henry leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly as the last of the federal vehicles pulled out of the neighborhood. Ethan sat down next to him, still trying to wrap his head around everything. "You know," Henry said, stretching his legs out, "I fought a lot of battles in my life. Been in war zones, seen some real nasty fights." He took a slow sip of his coffee, shaking his head with amusement. "But I got to tell you, kid," he smirked, "taking down an HOA might have been the easiest war I've ever won." The moment Henry Grayson stepped out of the black SUV, it was as if the entire world had been waiting for him. The street outside his house, the same street where the HOA had ruled like kings for years, was now filled with something entirely different. People, neighbors, families, reporters, and they weren't afraid anymore. They were cheering. A sea of faces lined the sidewalks, standing on porches, leaning out of windows. Some held their phones up, recording the moment. Others just stood there, watching with a mixture of relief, admiration, and something else, something like awe. Because Henry Grayson wasn't just coming home. He was returning as the man who had done the impossible. And the press? They were everywhere. Microphones were thrust forward, cameras flashing in rapid bursts, voices overlapping in an eager frenzy. "Mr. Grayson, how does it feel to be back? Mr. Grayson, did you ever think this day would come? Mr. Grayson, what do you have to say to the people who tried to take your home?" Henry didn't rush to answer. He just stood there for a moment, taking it all in, the sight of his house, the porch swing that had been there for decades, the familiar creak of the wooden steps beneath his boots. The place they had tried to erase from existence, but it was still here. And so was he. Ethan stood beside him, watching as people clapped, called his grandfather a hero, shook his hand, patted him on the back, thanked him not just for what he had done now, but for what he had done long before any of this ever started. Because Henry Grayson wasn't just a stubborn old man who refused to sell his house. He was a soldier, a veteran, a survivor, a fighter. He had fought for his country in a war most people barely remembered anymore. He had survived battles that would have broken lesser men. And then, when he came home, he had fought again, not on some distant battlefield, not against an enemy overseas, but right here, in the very place he had called home for decades. Because power-hungry bureaucrats in an HOA boardroom thought they could break him. They thought they could erase him, the same way they had erased so many others. They thought they could bully him into silence. They had no idea who they were up against. And now? Now they were gone. Their bank accounts were frozen. Their houses seized. Their power wiped out in a matter of hours. And Henry? Henry was still standing. Ethan let out a slow breath, shaking his head as the realization hit him. His grandfather wasn't just some guy who refused to move. Henry Grayson was history, the kind of man people would tell stories about, the kind of man they would write books about, the kind of man who couldn't be erased no matter how hard someone tried. The HOA had thrown everything at him. They had tried to break him, to beat him, to strip him of everything he had built. And yet, here he was standing taller than ever, as the world watched and applauded his Tory. Ethan looked at his grandfather, the bruises on his face already fading, the same steady fire still burning in his eyes. Henry glanced at him, smirked just a little, and clapped a firm hand on Ethan's shoulder. "You know what the funny thing is, kid?" Henry said, his voice low and amused. Ethan raised an eyebrow. "What?" Henry let out a slow exhale, scanning the crowd, the cameras, the people who once feared the HOA but were now free because of him. "They thought they could take me down," he chuckled, shaking his head. "Turns out, I was the one taking them down all along." If you were the one in this story, how would you react? Would you stand up and fight back, or accept the unreasonable pressure and control from the HOA? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe, like, and share this video with more people. Your small action gives us the motivation to keep bringing you more intense and engaging stories. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.